In this video, I quickly speed paint a beloved Games Workshop terrain kit that I've had in a drawer for nearly 20 years. If you've been into Warhammer for a long time, you've probably seen this terrain before. It came in a Warhammer 40k starter box with Space Marines and Tyranids. No, not that one. And it's been out of production for like a very long time. In fact, just recently, I've seen finished sales, like completed sales, of this crashed Aquila Imperial Lander sprue, is what people generally call it, on eBay for around $60. And I have one. Actually, I've had it for a very long time. So I've not had this terrain sprue since it originally came out with the Battle for Macragge, I don't know, the starter set back in October of 2004, nearly 20 years ago. But I've had it nearly as long. I think I bought it off a local guy who bought that starter box set, and he didn't really want the terrain. I think, if I remember correctly, he was buying his second box to get more of the Space Marines and, the Tyranids and stuff like that, and didn't feel like he needed another crashed spaceship crashed in exactly the same way as the other one, right? And which, honestly, I get it, but I coveted this terrain piece, and I paid him to obtain it. And then it was mine. And then it went in a drawer. I have moved house twice since obtaining this sprue, and it's been, if I had to guess, 15 years since I first got it, at least, and then, took it and then just put it in a drawer. I would see it when looking for stuff in that drawer, but I'll be honest, it wasn't very frequently. It was not, a drawer that I went into too frequently. Once every few years, I'd come across it and I'd think, oh yeah, no, I should really paint that. That could be a fun, quick project. But there was a part of me that knew how long I'd been holding on to it, and I thought, well, I shouldn't quickly do it, shouldn't quickly paint it up. I should take my time. It's old and cool and, frankly, very, very out of production. Actually, that part of me was wrong. Wanting to put tons of time into a terrain paint job just isn't for me, I've discovered. I've learned that painted terrain is always better than old, kind of rare terrain that's still on the sprue and unpainted. Also, I found over the years that spending lots of time on painting terrain to a very fancy standard is time wasted, in my mind. I want the models to be the focus of the battle, so therefore the terrain needs to be there, be painted, and kind of not outshine the figures in my warband or army. I've talked about this before. Pachow. So I recently came across this sprue again. I looked it over and decided it was time to speed paint it up. And step one was to finally clip it from the sprue. It actually felt kind of freeing to clip it after a decade and a half of staring at it, in a drawer. Now, I wasn't just going to completely cut corners and slap this thing out. I was looking for speed and efficiency, but I'm not a savage, right? So I did shave off all the little nubbins where the clippers had, clipped, I guess. There's all that. And there wasn't really too much in the way of mold lines because the majority of these were all kind of one-sided. The only mold lines really were on the stabilizer fin that gets glued to the back of the craft, so I made sure to also get rid of those things as well. After that, it was time to prime. Usually, I'll use rattle can primer on plastic kits like this. It's faster due to basically a larger spray pattern, right? And since terrain frequently takes more abuse than your models do, I usually find rattle can primer sticks to the plastic better, which allows it to take that abuse without chipping the paint. Unfortunately, it had been raining for days at this point around here, so I had to airbrush on the primer, which is certainly a bit slower, but it was quicker than waiting for the rain to stop. I started with black primer. Now at this point, I had a decision to make. I knew I wanted this crashed ship to be blue. Maybe ultramarines, maybe something else, wasn't really that important. And usually, I would then start using airbrush paints over this black primer, right? Kind of like a zenithal. I would have done a probably dark blue base pass after the black, and then a lighter blue for the highlights using airbrush colors and all that kind of stuff. However, a lot of each of these different terrain pieces in the kit are also made up of a lot of like ground bits too, dirt and stone and stuff like that. And I didn't want to get those parts blue with overspray from my airbrush. If I did, then I'd have to go back and paint over them, all those parts again, with opaque paints using a brush. And I wasn't really planning on using too many opaque paints in this paint job. Again, my plan was to speed paint this terrain. Therefore, I was going to use mostly all speed paints, minus some dry brushing, at the end and such. So I decided to just do a standard like white to black zenithal. This would allow the zenithal to show through the blue color that I was going to use on the ship, which would be a transparent speed paint. And I was going to put it on the ship with a brush, that blue, so I could control it more and not get it onto the ground parts. Was this the right plan? For this project, I think it was. I wouldn't paint a regular vehicle with speed paints and a brush because, you're putting it on a lot of flat areas. Speed paints, contrast, things like that aren't great on big flat areas. They're okay in certain spots, but on vehicles, which are real big flat areas, you'll get splotching and things like that. But in this situation, being a ruined vehicle that's been outdoors for who knows how long, but some splotching is fine. I used matte white air paint from the Army Painter for my white part of the zenithal, right? But I didn't want it to be too white, so I didn't overdo it. That kind of makes the overall effect look more of like a gray to black instead of a white to black, although you can push it a little bit harder in spots to give you even a bit more of a highlight and that kind of stuff. That all said, I got back to the hobby table after airbrushing, and I still wanted a fair amount of kind of brighter contrast on the model before the speed paints went on. So I dry brushed on some white opaque paint with a big, soft, cheap makeup brush. This catches mostly on the hard edges and adds tons of definition to the model for the next steps. Then it was time to start painting the crashed ship blue. I used High Lord Blue speed paint from the Army Painter and put it on as quickly as I could with a larger brush, but still something I could control easily. Bigger brushes, the benefit to them, they can carry more paint, so you're not constantly going back to fill up your brush with more pigment, which slows you down and can be problematic when using speed paints or contrast paints. Because, when the first layer, then you go back and do the layer that bumps up against it, you get that kind of coffee stain line and that kind of stuff. It makes the flat, areas sort of splotchy, like I mentioned before. But luckily for this project, splotchy was okay, as the vehicle, like I said, has been crashed for years. Even though the whole idea behind this is I was trying to speed paint, this part still took a long time. Just covering all the big parts of the terrain model with a brush, even a larger, like size 4 brush like I used, it still took several hours. Upon further reflection, if I had done all the blue parts with the airbrush and then hand painted all the other parts, mostly the ground and the other like non-blue parts of the aircraft, I might have saved a little bit more time, but it's hard to say. Probably, yes, probably, as there was a lot of, blue surface area. But then I couldn't have used as many speed paints and washes in other areas. Honestly, it's still hard to say. Then it was finally time to start on the other parts of the crashed vehicle. I used Satchel Brown speed paint on the other metal parts, like engine stuff and so on, that I wanted to look corroded, kind of dark brown with a bit of a reddish to it. I used dark tone black wash on the engine exhaust nozzles and stuff like that, and other vents and such. Since I wanted to make it look as if the craft had once been blue with like white details on the wings, I figured that the white parts would have also corroded out in the dirt and the elements and that kind of stuff. So I used a very light wash called, strangely enough, light tone wash over those parts. I hadn't moved on to the ground bits yet around the terrain, but I wanted to add a bit of pop to the blue. So at this time I went back with an opaque color, Viking blue, to dry brush kind of sparingly on the edges of the craft to kind of sort of very quickly edge highlight some certain spots. I wasn't real sure how this project was coming out at this point, to be perfectly honest with you. It was in what many painters will refer to as the ugly phase of a paint job. And I was wondering if I had been wasting my time, I hate to have to like prime it over and start again, but I decided to trust the process and push on to see if it would eventually kind of leave the ugly phase, I guess. At this point, it was time to start work on the ground bits. I used a brown wash, strong tone, and put it only on the bits of the ground that were what I determined to be like dirt versus rock, right? Like all the ground is either dirt or rock on these particular pieces. I wanted to mostly keep the rock parts, the gray to black zenithal that I originally had done. So I mostly just focused the wash on the dirt parts. This was relatively quick because even if I messed up a little bit and got some wash on the rock, it'd be easy to fix it, or, honestly, it'd get fixed later with more dry brushing. And there were a lot more parts to do. Some parts laying around the vehicle and stuff like that were just like there, you know what I mean? And I didn't need to make everything separate colors, but some of them didn't seem like they should necessarily, they could have been blue, or maybe the dark brown that I used on the engine bays and things like that, but it just seemed easier to just make them kind of more like a neutral gray. So I used Gravelord Gray speed paint on debris bits and other kind of undetermined stuff around the crash site. Again, the focus should be on the models and not all of the parts to the crashed spaceship. I could call out some more of those details later in the process if I kind of felt it was worth it. Then I thought it'd be a good time to really tie everything back together again and just do a big overall wash on everything. And I used this wash recipe that I had learned from Sonic Sledgehammer here on YouTube, Pachow, which he calls marine juice, I believe. Mine's a bit different than his. I use a bottle of Army Painter Dark Tone wash, a bottle of Army Painter Flesh Tone wash, or just Flesh Wash, or whatever it's called, and then a bottle of Army Painter Wash Medium. And that's it. Just pour all three of those bottles together, and I keep it in a big bottle and a little bottle because when I mixed it all together, it didn't all fit into the big bottle, and so I had to put it in a little bottle as well. And I like using it kind of liberally over an entire model when I want to sort of grunge everything up, but not too much. It's not like an enamel wash and things like that. You just put it over there, let it, and it just helps a bit. I don't usually use it on terrain, but I felt like this piece kind of needed it. Once everything was dry from the marine juice, which took a long time, I'm not going to lie, I was finally starting to like where this was going, and that kind of took a weight off. I got out some silver opaque paint called gunmetal to dry brush onto the model, again, along edges and stuff like that. Nothing makes a piece of plastic look more like metal than a bit of metal dry brush on the edges. And I used a smaller, cheap kind of makeup brush to dry brush the metal onto the vehicle, moving in the direction that the wind would have moved across the aircraft back when it flew around, through battle and stuff like that before eventually kind of crashing here. It's pretty convincing, I think. There were certain parts of the aircraft, like the kind of open engine compartments and the black exhaust nozzles, that needed more attention with the silver dry brushing. This didn't need to be directional like I was doing before on the hull. It needed to be kind of thorough and sort of omnidirectional. This, again, kind of helps to convince the eye that these parts are old corroded metal, and it's frankly easy and fun to do. I caught a few more spots that needed special attention with the silver dry brush, and then it was time for the last step. After dry brushing the vehicle, we now needed to dry brush the ground around the vehicle. At this point, the ground was either gray rocks from the original zenithal spray, or the brown wash dirt. I found a light gray opaque color, I forget which it was, and I dry brushed it over both ground parts. This really helps to kind of blend the brown dirt and the gray stone bits together, making things look a lot more natural as well. And if I got a little bit overzealous and got gray dry brushing onto the vehicle itself or some of the parts around the vehicle, this was no problem. Gray dry brushing is always welcomed in any kind of ruins, buildings, vehicles, etc. And that's it, a terrain speed run on a kit that I've been sitting on for the better part of 2 decades. I'm glad I finally sped through it, even if it took me a really long time to get started from the time that I bought it off that guy till today. I did finally like how it turned out. It was, again, like I said, in the ugly phase for quite a while, but then it got much better at the end. But honestly, that's how most of my model paint jobs turn out as well. They usually don't look good until the end, and that's okay. All that's important is the final product. Don't worry as you go through working on a piece, they generally all look weird until you finish. I hope you learned something from these techniques for speed painting terrain. I hope that maybe you'll get the motivation to finish up a terrain project that you've been stalling on for months, years, maybe even nearly 20 years. Do you have any really old terrain projects that you're trying to finish, or do you have some recently completed ones that you're pretty proud of? How'd you do it? Does speed painting this kind of thing, terrain like that, help in your opinion, or is it the wrong way to go about it? I'd love to hear what you think down in the comments below. If you liked this video, please hit the like button. It really does help kind of get it out to other people, and you get maybe tiny fireworks or tiny confetti. It's still up for debate. You should check it out down below. Subscribe if you want to see more, and thanks for watching.